everything as before. The Chinese Grand Prix turned back the clock, meaning Ferrari returned to being the usual Ferrari, very similar to the 2024 version, namely a team that tries but struggles, suffers, attempts two different strategies, yet in the end loses around 0.4 per lap and finishes in 5th with Charles Leclerc and 6th place with Lewis Hamilton at the end of an anonymous race, certainly below expectations and never really in a position to challenge McLaren, the absolute dominator with Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris on Sunday at the 5.45 1-kilometer Shanghai International Circuit. But if things had only gone this way, it would have been somewhat normal. Instead, 3 hours after the race ended, a devastating blow arrived. Charles Leclerc was disqualified because his car was found to be underweight by 1 kilogram with all the fuel drained, even with the FIA fitting a spare front wing after his was damaged in the race, and Lewis Hamilton was disqualified for excessive wear on the car's floor. 2 cars removed from the classification for 2 different reasons, something painful for the most prestigious team in Formula One. These were not shocking infractions that gave Ferrari any major advantage or impacted the result, but it takes very little to be outside the rules, and the FIA was ruthless. Under normal conditions, 3 teams had finished ahead of Ferrari in Shanghai: McLaren, Mercedes, and Red Bull. Too many, even with all the mitigating factors. The only positive was that the gaps were not enormous compared to Mercedes and Red Bull, confirming the anomaly of Melbourne and the fact that Ferrari was not, and is not, that bad or that far from the top overall. Charles Leclerc, with a damaged front wing from an accidental collision with Lewis Hamilton in the opening corners, stated at the finish line that without the damage which caused a loss of grip, he could have even fought for victory. A bit too optimistic? Perhaps, but the monegasque driver is not one to make empty claims. In any case, Charles Leclerc needed to bounce back after an underwhelming sprint race, and he did so in style, defending well and being faster than his Maranello teammate, the opposite of the previous day, when Lewis Hamilton dominated the mini Grand Prix, salvaging Ferrari's Asian trip. McLaren had no rivals, with Lando Norris finally making a good start and immediately taking second place from George Russell. However, Oscar Piastri controlled the race, set the pace, and gained enough confidence to boldly declare that he is now aiming for the 2025 Formula One championship. Lando Norris, the championship leader, certainly does not agree. But the reality is that McLaren currently has an advantage over everyone. Mercedes is the second force, with George Russell making few mistakes and always finishing near the front, though the car is not on McLaren's level. Then there is Red Bull, with Max Verstappen staying under the radar for 3/4 of the race before unleashing his full potential, brilliantly overtaking Charles Leclerc. However, at the moment, his car has too many shortcomings. In the end, as we said, the cold shower from race control hit Ferrari. The missing kilogram on Charles Leclerc's car was a miscalculation. These things happen to everyone. Last year, George Russell dominated the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa but was excluded from the classification for the same reason. As for Lewis Hamilton's floor infraction, Ferrari is paying the price for having to run higher to avoid excessive skid wear. In the sprint race, with little fuel and limited mileage, the wear was insignificant, but in a full race with more weight and more laps to cover, Ferrari was forced into a different setup, and something went wrong. Now Formula One takes a 1-week break before returning to the track in Suzuka. That will be the first real test for everyone, especially for Ferrari, which has won one of the 3 races but is still far from convincing. And above all, after the Shanghai incident, it will now have to take a hard look at itself. According to the Italian media, Ferrari is now accelerating development and corrections to the SF-25 single-seater should be seen on track soon. Will Loic Serra's influence on the F1 car be visible as early as Japan? What is certain is that the Maranello team is experiencing hectic hours after an unprecedented double disqualification for the Prancing Horse, a setback that does not rule out title chances but casts some shadows over Ferrari's project. The race against time has therefore begun, from Saturday's joy to Sunday's drama. If the Shanghai weekend had ended with the sprint race, won by Lewis Hamilton, people would be talking about a reborn Ferrari in full battle with McLaren. Instead, the sprint race was just a sweet illusion for fans, one that vanished in the difficulties of the Chinese Grand Prix and forgotten with the 2 stewards' statements, marking a heavy 0-0 in terms of points won on Sunday. If Charles Leclerc's case can be considered an oversight, very similar to Mercedes' issue with George Russell last season, the seven-time Formula One world champion's disqualification is more concerning. And what if it's true that the SF-25 needs to be raised off the ground just to avoid wearing out the skid plate? Is this a teething issue or a design flaw? Lewis Hamilton was disqualified from the Chinese GP because of excessive skid wear, with the skid blocks being 0.5 millimeters under the 9 millimeters minimum. The infractions cost Ferrari 18 points and means they now trail Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship after the first two races of the 2025 Formula One season. The Italian side made an important change to their suspension for the SF-25, in a bid to open up development opportunities and close in on McLaren after losing out in the Constructors' Championship. The resulting effect seems to be that the car must now be run lower than they did in 2024, which is why they fell foul of the rules in the Chinese Grand Prix last weekend. There was a lot of hype around Ferrari at the start of the 2025 Formula One Championship, particularly as Lewis Hamilton joined the team and is hunting for his 8th world title with the famous Maranello-based squad. Now worrying reports are emerging from the Italian press. Italian daily newspaper Corriere dello Sport is the one that speaks of hectic hours, technical meetings, and anxious calls with Ferrari team principal Frédéric Vasseur. The result at the Shanghai circuit is unacceptable, and on Suzuka's demanding track, the Ferrari technicians and engineers must clearly do better. The responsibility now falls on technical director Loic Serra, who has already returned to Maranello and will have to unlock the car's potential as soon as possible. A new floor was initially planned for the Bahrain Grand Prix, but as suggested by Italian journalist Jacopo Dorsi in La Stampa, it could now be brought forward to Japan in 2 weeks. A promising sign perhaps, indicating that the Prancing Horse's engineers have already identified the root cause of the car's struggles. The time for a resurgence is now. Last year, Ferrari was a very good-natured car that worked with a bit higher ground clearance. Apparently that's no longer the case this year, and it seems that Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton have to drive this Ferrari extremely low, which is why it looks after 2 races that it cannot keep up with the competition. At the Albert Park circuit in Melbourne, they had raised the SF-25 car after fears they would come into conflict with the plank. Ferrari have, after the Chinese Grand Prix, that they made a calculation error, which means they are at the limit with the ground clearance. Ferrari therefore leaves China with many key questions regarding the ability of the SF-25 to compete with McLaren and even Mercedes and Red Bull, given they felt it was potentially in the run for a race victory. The Maranello team was stronger than previously thought at Melbourne in the Australian Grand Prix, but a series of operational and strategy errors ultimately led to a disappointing race. They will want to use Japan to bounce back, after a tough start to their 2025 Formula One campaign.